Welcome back, everybody. Now it's time for something completely different, which is our first panel session of the week, which we've cunningly arranged under the broad and very broad theme of visual storytelling. When we put the Graphical Web conference program together a little while back, we thought it would be quite a good idea to put a spin, a theme for the conference based on what we saw was, a trend in the application of the technology that we've learned a lot about. And so we used visual storytelling because we thought that was really vague. And we could use it to cover a really wide range of topics, both for talks and also for this panel session. And then I started writing out to people and saying, would you be interested in joining our panel session? And I got some responses from this following collection of handsome individuals here. And I said to them, oh, well, if you'd like to give me a description of yourself that we can use to introduce you, then please give it to me. Otherwise, I'll use your descriptions off of Twitter. And guess what? Nobody gave me So let's go through these people, because you might not match the photo to the person. I mean, particularly for Tobias there.
It's just like me, come on.
I'm kind of, So we've got Scott Murray. We heard Scott's keynote earlier, and obviously really thrilled to have Scott here, and obviously with his both his book and all the other things that he does. We're really pleased to have him as part of the panel. Jeremy has combed his hair a little for us from the picture, but Jeremy has spoken earlier this week from Interactive Things in Zurich. We have Bella. We've had a number of colleagues from the BBC visual journalism team join us now for the rest of the week, and Bella works in the visual journalism team. Many of you will have seen and heard from Robert this week. Research scientist at Tableau, but also the author of a very interesting paper on storytelling, which we may refer to later, and who runs the Eager Eyes blog. And I'm delighted to say we've got Martin Staber from the Financial Times Interactive team has joined us, and Tobias. Tobias, there's a lack of metadata on your Twitter profile. But Tobias, again, we heard a great talk from Tobias and Emma yesterday, formerly at the Guardian digital agency, now rebranded Graphic. So welcome, Tobias. So what we thought we would do, we have had a few questions on the hashtags, which we will refer to later. But to start with, what I thought I'd do is open up to our speakers 5 minutes each just to pick a single issue relating to visual storytelling that they'd like to discuss or share with us. So, Martin, do you want to?
Right, so, is this on? I'm going to sort of plow through this so everybody else has time. So there's a lot more detail on these slides, so if you follow that URL, you can see some of that. So I work in a team that does data visualization in a journalism context, and this is something that news organizations have been doing for a very, very long time. At the FT, we're particularly experienced with financial data, of course, and have been using systems for heavily automating this stuff for about 20 years now. However, even interactivity we've been doing for about nearly 10 years now. And but for the first 5 or 6 years of that, it was not that dissimilar from the print process that we have done for 125 years, which is basically a rectangle on a page. But of course, all of that's changed in the last few years, probably in the last 3 years, to a world where news is definitely online first, and the workflows has to be upended and done for the online medium well before the legacy medium. And that means some big changes in our workflows, and it also means big changes in the skill sets and processes that we use. So one of the big changes is dynamically generated graphics. And of course, everybody here is very familiar with this, but for a traditionally trained graphic designer working in a newspaper context, this is a big change from editing in the office and publishing once, often in batches, so it all has to be done once at the end of the day, to an environment where you're serving the data and rendering it on the client side is quite a radical transformation. And a lot of this stuff, so I'm going to skip ahead a bit, because I know some of my colleagues are going to be speaking about some of these aspects, kind of require a re-education of some of the sort of people we work with. And I assume this is something that everyone here has in common, regardless of what type of organization they work for. There's a great phrase used in the New York Times last week from Monica Rogati from Jawbone, who described working with data civilians. And I think everyone has their data civilians who need to learn what is required and what works well in order to make the most of your resources. So over the last 6 months or so, we've been collecting all of the sort of horror stories and all of the difficulties we've had explaining what we do to other people in our organization, and we've tried to boil it down to one piece of A4, one sheet of A4 that we can hand out and say, read this before you come to us. And there's basically 3 messages. One is embrace granularity, and I'll go through these quite quickly, understand the options of what's possible and what we can do, and then a sort of bullet point list of 5 things that we require and one thing that we'd like to have, which we encourage everyone to think about before they even ask for our help with anything. And I've not really discussed this in front of anyone external before, and so I'd like to hear what you think of our list. But let me start with the beginning, granularity. By this I mean, if you're rendering something on the client side rather than preparing it as a static image and then serving it, suddenly you create the ability to drill down and to do all the wonderful things that we can do online that we could never do in our legacy one-way media. But a lot of people who've not worked in this way for a long time, this is quite a difficult thing to understand. For years, their job was to boil the data down into one little nugget and then present that, rather than get all of it. And so that means making people understand that they need to get all the data, not just the top-line figures. And also to start asking very different questions from what certainly newspaper reporters are used to asking for. They're used to asking, what's the average? What's the biggest? What's the smallest? But in fact, the new question we want them to ask is, just give me everything and I'll figure it out. Broadly, there's 3 types of things we do. Integrated multimedia stories. I won't use the S word for the shorthand for that. The menu and list story, which is basically anything that has a structured content that's different from the blob of text we usually write. And then finally, the thing that we're most familiar with and probably the most involved is what we might generically call a news application or data visualization. I have some examples of that if you want to look at them. But so the 5 essentials that we think it comes down to, just based on experience of doing this for several years and things that don't work and things that do work, here are the 5 things we ask people to think about. The data visualization in a news context, and this is probably true of other contexts as well, needs to tell a story. This means not just hand over a huge pile of data with no context provided, leaving the user to figure it out, but providing a narrative layer on top of that. Something that can't be told in a simpler way. Often interactivity is used as a bauble that signals importance rather than something that's actually essential for telling a story. Using data analysis that's integral to the thing you're trying to tell, rather than, again, something that is added after information that's been gleaned in some more conventional manner. Be of lasting value. A lot of this stuff is very labor intensive, and therefore thinking about it as more of a product rather than a transitory individual story is often important. And involve people in my team or from the start. And this is also something that's culturally quite new to news organizations. And then on top of that, at least one of the following. And these are kind of the things that work particularly well when doing interactive as opposed to static graphics. Having a narrative that has both a macro and a micro view, a zoom in and zoom out type layer, ideally personalization being the zoom in layer. And personal relevancy is a line I've stolen from Bella, I believe. something that automates a repetitive process, something that can be dynamically updated as new information becomes available. Integrate social media is kind of probably particularly important for news organizations. I'm not sure how that translates to other organizations. And also thinks beyond graphics. How can we take data inputs and generate other types of things? One area of interest at the moment is Twitter bots, for example, or automated emails. Not necessarily the output of a data product doesn't necessarily need to be a website. So there's a lot more behind that, but I don't want to take up everybody else's time.
Thanks, Martin. Bella, are you got
Sure,
some slides?
yes, of course. Hello everyone, thank you Alan for having me today. I'm a journalist too, and I work on the visual journalism team at the BBC. Now the visual journalism team is made up of journalists like myself, a few of us, online journalists, online designers, developers, some of them are here today, and TV designers. And we're responsible for producing all of the graphic or storytelling, if you like, on TV. So the two big news channels that BBC has, as well as big news programmes like the 1 o'clock news, the 6 and the 10, as well as all of the graphical content and the interactive storytelling on the news website. I'm just going to talk just about one thing, really, which is about responsive design that we've been working with for a couple of years now, and it's just kind of some of the things that I've learned from that along the process. So this is the landscape that news organisations are living in right now. So this has completely changed the way that we do things, essentially. Over the past 2 years, an increasing number of people are coming to our site using tablets and mobiles. And that has meant that the desktop has become less important in some senses. So that has a big impact on how we tell our stories, because we can't serve a shonky experience up to half our audience, essentially. We've got to serve them very well. And so that led us to working with responsive design, which is essentially, many of you will know, using one code base to create content that appears on different screen sizes, but you're not creating different versions. Essentially, it's the same version, although it might appear differently on different devices. I just have to say at this point that the BBC still has two sites, has a desktop site and a responsive site, and soon the desktop site will be disappearing completely. So we're sort of responsive-ish at the moment, not entirely, but we're following the main precepts of it. Anyway, so I picked this particular project, which I didn't put a link into just in case the internet didn't work, but you can look it up. It's Syria's refugee exodus, because it was a tricky one. And even though we've been working with responsive design, creating the versions for smaller devices, phones, smaller tablets, ordinary sized tablets, all the way up to desktop, it was tricky because I think we came into it with some preconceptions about the data. It's a really good data set from the UN which showed the origin and the destination of refugees from Syria since the start of the crisis. It's obviously a massive story and one that's really worth telling. Right. So what did we learn? So initially we were trying to do an interactive map. We were trying to visualize the data, have some kind of map that you could filter, but this just didn't work. And when we kind of boiled it down to what we wanted to do on mobiles, so we knocked a few ideas around for quite a long time, and eventually came up with the one that you sort of saw before and all its different versions. And this just shows you a couple of iterations. I was very keen on arrows and clickable maps, but it didn't really work. We tried it in lots of different ways. It just didn't really work. So we ended up with ditching the map at the top and moving into something that was a bit more graphics based, so with bars that filled up. So essentially this sort of leads into kind of some of the main things which we've learned over the couple of years that we've been using responsive design and telling our stories across all these different devices. So the key thing for a journalist is to never lose sight of the story, is to never lose sight of the key content that you need to tell the story. You might lose interactivity, but you mustn't lose sight of your objectives and how you want to tell that story. So I suppose the narrative goes that you have to start with mobile first with responsive design. Well, that's sort of true. Actually, you have to start with all of them at the same time, really. But what you can't do so much, in my experience, and we have tried, I think, is to retrofit some lovely big glossy experience which you've laboured over on a desktop down to a mobile and expect it to really work. So you have to consider from the outset all of the different ways in which you're going to render those graphics and display those graphics. You might have to be more creative, I guess, with your design, instead of going into it with a sort of strongly held view about what you want to display. And as a journalist, I think it's important to say that writing really pithy, simple information in small screen sizes is a really good discipline. It's kind of harking back to CFAX days, if you like. But if you can tell a story in a very short number of words, 50 words, then that's good, and that works well across devices. It's not just something which is for mobile, because to be honest, lots of people don't often want to read screeds of text on any device that they're using. So boiling the story down to its key components is essential. Right. I'll come to that one in a minute. And the other thing is to leave, the big kind of lesson that we've learned is to leave plenty of time for QAing all your work. That's been, a hard-learned lesson, I think. And obviously, as a public service organisation, we have to support a huge number of browsers. So that can cause all sorts of issues. And so for many of you, if you're creating content, you may choose not to support various things like Explorer, but we have to. Okay, and finally, I'll leave you this as a change of tack, but I'll just leave you this as my kind of plea as a journalist. It's the shark map test, which you might find quite useful. This graphic I pulled off Twitter a couple of months ago, and it always makes me laugh. And so what it's telling us, essentially, is that shark attacks happen in areas that have a coastline. I don't want to put anybody in a difficult situation who created this, but clearly it's quite funny, and it doesn't. And there is other information here, but that's not the thing that's visualised. The thing that you take away from it is that shark maps happen where there's a coast. So you can use this as a quick test for your own work, and I urge you to do so, because it helps you to focus on the storytelling. Take a step back and see just exactly what are you telling people. Because if you're telling people the sort of metaphorical equivalent of that sharks live in the sea, then your visualization isn't really working hard enough. It needs to have a story. It needs to tell somebody something they don't know. It needs to be news in a sense. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bella. We've got Robert up next, and I'm just going to allay fears. We've got no sharks in Portsmouth Harbour tonight.
So I'm Robert. I just threw together a few slides just a few minutes ago, so I'm calling this storytelling, I have opinions, and actually I'm going to just talk about two things here. But before that, since you only saw this stylized avatar, I figured I'd show you another picture of me. So I call this cuteness by proximity. Because the dog isn't really all that cute, right? So I need to help. But anyway, so but what this is not just for fun and to show off my dog, but also this notion of people actually coming up with stories when they see something. So you can always look at pictures of people and animals and make up stories very quickly. So it's very easy to just do that, and that's an impulse we have. And that's actually an impulse we have to be careful with, because we tend to think that the story we tell is the one everybody else would tell about the same picture or the same visual. So we have to be careful with that. And I actually have an image for that, but before that, since my paper was mentioned, I figured I'd bring this up again. Not to be, overly annoying with this, but it's actually getting quite a bit of attention, and people are actually reading my papers now, which is interesting. Never did that when I was in academia. So I figured I'd just kind of bring this up here and give you a chance to see what it is. So this was in IEEE Computer about a year ago, but it's on the web. You can find my website if you just Google my name or the title, and you're going to find the paper there. But I wanted to talk very briefly about things I already talked about. So one thing, or this thing that I just talked about yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about what it is again. If you missed my talk yesterday, you can read up on it on the web. It's like everywhere. Google Minar, and you're going to find it. But my point here is that there is a lot of storytelling going on about things. So people talk about things telling a story when they're not actually doing that. So today, I said this yesterday, sometimes I feel more like arguing for and sometimes more against this being a story. So today I'm going to argue against this being a story. because well, all it does is it shows you the data, it shows you the facts, and you make up the story, or maybe you know the story, you know enough about the background, you can read, if you read French, it's actually pretty easy to read the description, and it tells you enough so that you know what's going on here. And then you can come up with a story. And the story is misleading too, because what Minard does here at the bottom is he's got this line chart which shows temperature, and it seems to say that many of the men who died on the way back from Moscow actually died because of the cold, but it's not actually true. Most of them died, and in fact, the biggest loss of life, I'm going to try and point, I'm not sure this is going to be successful. Biggest loss of life occurred here at this river crossing because it was too warm, because the ice wasn't thick enough, so they had to build bridges, and it took too long, and so the Russians were just slaughtering them while they were trying to build bridges. So the implication here is actually wrong. So we're very, very eager to tell stories, but very often we're telling the wrong story. So we have to be very careful with that. And I think that's also why we need to guide people and have more intricate and more explicit storytelling, where we actually walk people through things and where we tell them what's going on. First of all, certainly the facts, but also, to an extent, the interpretation, because we certainly want to leave some of that up to people, and how much of that should be left up to people, to the audience, is of course an open question. But we also need to be careful not to make it too open and leave it open for misinterpretation. That's my first point. And my second point is about the lack of good examples and I should be careful. So I've been using a lot of news examples, and a lot of storytelling in the news is very much the graphical news stories are very similar to the way a lot of news stories are written, which have this kind of inverted pyramid structure that have a clearly defined beginning, and then they have lots of facts, lots of interesting things in them, but they don't usually end with a clear conclusion or a clear end point. And so the same is true for a lot of visual stories. They introduce you to something, then they tell you stuff, they show you stuff, and they walk you through something, but they don't really have an end. There's no to use a term I don't actually like, there's no punchline. This is a term that Moritz Stefana uses to argue against stories. And he's certainly right in saying we don't need a story for everything. But I wonder if we should have clearer punchlines or clearer conclusions for the stories that we create that are more story-like, that are more narrative, and that are really meant to be consumed as stories and not as visualizations or as news apps, I guess. That's my second point. And with that, I'm going to leave it open to other folks. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. We've got Jeremy up next.
So I'm Jeremy, I work at Interactive Things. We're a database studio from Zurich, and I'm going to talk today in my role as a database, I guess, mercenary for the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. So in the past 1.5 years, we have collaborated on a lot of graphics and interactive, I guess, storytelling pieces. And I just want to give you a quick rundown of the kinds of projects we did together. So one kind of project would be long-form stories. So we did, I think, 4 bigger stories where we made actually multiple different graphics and interactive graphics and static graphics and set up the whole site. So I guess that was after the whole snowfall hype, Switzerland caught up and recognized it would be a good thing for certain stories. Then there are more dynamic, I guess, news apps, exploratory visualizations we made. Then graphics which are more self-contained. They contain a story. They work as a complete story, I guess, in the sense that Robert means. And also there are one aspect we also try to do is make graphics reusable because they're expensive. And in this case, we extended basically the same graphic for another piece. And to bring this to an end, there are graphics which we made which are intended to be completely reusable. For example, election results, which come up in 4 years, I guess. And in the context of storytelling, I wanted to make a few points which haven't been brought up so far, to confuse you even more about what storytelling might mean. So I think one aspect is also it's about intent. So a graphic can tell a story by itself, but it can also support a story. So in that sense, I don't think the graphic itself always needs to tell a story, because it's also embedded in a story, or it can be. And this is going to be controversial. A graphic can deliberately avoid telling a story. So when we are trying not to make a point deliberately. And also, I think what determines the story is the context of a graphic. So it exists somewhere, be it in a bigger story, or in a country, in a city. I guess since the Neue Zürcher Zeitung is a Swiss newspaper, the audience isn't as international as it could be, and we don't publish most of the things in English or other languages than German. It exists at a point in time, and I think this also frames a graphic and tells a story, or enables a graphic to tell a story which wouldn't make sense or wouldn't tell a story at a different point in time. And also it's made by someone, which, I mean, the NZZ is known to be a very serious, respected Swiss newspaper, and I guess that context also tells you something about what is produced. And that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for that. So intent and context, I think they're buzzwords that will come back during discussion, I hope. Next up, we've got Tobias.
Yes, excellent. Right, I want to talk about something that I don't think has been covered in the conference, at least not in the sessions I've been in, and that's the coming zombie apocalypse. This is a serious matter in the southeast of England. We live in an international travel hub. When zombification breaks out, it is going to spread fast. Models suggest that there will be an exponential growth. And we are doomed. Our houses are not safe places. We need to arm ourselves. I'm going to stop there because this is very silly. I've got a whole presentation of this and I really want to say it. I made this to entertain my team, essentially, who I have a lot of horror nerds in my team. But it was making this chart that made me realize quite how well charts work at visual storytelling. This is a simple bar chart showing the effective ranges of various weapons, but it becomes a drama. You start picking off zombies with your sniper rifle and a clear headshot from a nice safe distance. They're starting to get closer. You're having to rely on shorter range weapons, shotguns, revolvers, and then one night you wake to the sound of the glass breaking in the patio door, and they're in the house, and you're down to conventional zombie killing weapons of cricket bats and chainsaws. Groovy. But there's too many of them. You're becoming overwhelmed. You run out of petrol for the chainsaw. You break a chair, seize the chair leg, beating them off, scrabbling around on the kitchen counter for a bread knife. The shapes of the bars become this rhythm of tension and drama. Scott McCloud talks about what he calls closure, which is what he says happens in the gaps between panels in a comic book. Those little white spaces where the audience start telling the story, where they're in charge and they're fully engaged in moving the story through time and space and filling in those gaps. And that is what happens between the gaps in a bar chart. And really, I want to just echo Robert, because of course Robert's right. The stories happen in relationship to audiences. And audiences are going to look for stories, and we need to understand the tools of storytelling and visual storytelling just as well as we understand the code we use and the design tools we use and the data we use, because we need to use it with that level of ability. That's all I have to say.
Thanks, Tobias. I don't think people wanted the zombie story to stop, actually. You built up enough tension for us to want it to live on. And finally, we got Scott with a few pointers.
I don't really consider myself a good storyteller, so I'm actually a little confused about why I'm up on the panel. But I do call myself an artist. I'm also definitely a designer. But calling yourself an artist is great because it gives you sort of license to disagree with people and kind of make up your own rules. In graduate school, I got really interested in this concept of nonlinear narrative and interactive storytelling, or really the perception of narrative and the perception of meaning where no meaning existed and where no meaning was possibly intended. So I just want to play for you this quick animation that got me obsessed with this idea. Okay, that's it. So I wish you could have seen your faces. There was so much drama. There were a couple of people sitting back there like, and there were some people like, you know, the little circle gets trapped in the box and the big triangle comes in, and I saw some people like, now they're in for it. So I totally love this, and this is actually a modern like Flash recreation of what was originally done on a film strip as a psychological experiment. Fritz Heider, Marianne Simmel, 1944. They created these animations just by like essentially painting on film strips and playing these animations for subjects. And just like that, there was no sound. And they would play it and then ask people to describe what just happened. So normally I like to survey kind of what people thought happened, but I'll just tell you kind of in general, people sometimes, nobody ever says, there were some white pixels that turned to black and black ones that turned to white, and that was sort of all that happened. Although that is really all that happened, but we sort of perceive these pixels turning on and off as shapes, and that becomes animation, and because of the movement and the shapes of these shapes and lines, we sort of attribute them personalities and characteristics, and they become characters that are living in this space of whiteness plus these lines, which are maybe walls. So usually the slightly larger triangle is seen as like a bully, and the two smaller shapes are seen as allies or friends or something. They're trying to escape the bully together. So it's, to me, this is like the most amazing example of how our brains read so readily into motion, animation, and graphics, and sort of this highlights huge concerns for me for visualization, where you want, on one hand, I love this idea of nonlinear narrative, because on one hand, I want to be able to just expose all the data, like we heard from a couple of the other panelists already. It's like you have the really sort of predefined story, maybe in a journalistic context, but you also want to expose all the data. You want people to be able to find their own story in that data, but you also don't want them to completely misinterpret it and see things that aren't actually there because they don't understand the data at the depth that you do, or they bring whatever assumptions to it, whatever it is. So anyway, two other experiments sort of related to that. Let's get rid of this guy. I did this project, so This is a while ago, and I'm going to try and run it, but it may not work. Anybody know Yahoo Answers? No, I don't think anybody uses it anymore. It's like, this isn't even going to work on the screen here. Yeah, and I think this is like really old. The API it used didn't work. Anyway, this is like an interface so that you could go through different Yahoo Answers, questions and answers. But I like hated their website, and I wanted sort of like this non-linear way, so you could just read the questions or just read the answers or whatever. And I could drop down into environment, but I don't think anything's going to come up, so that's fine. So anyway, it looks kind of like this. Really, really important, pressing information. I think Cameron got this Google job offer. I'm sure the BBC is going to be knocking on my door in just a second. Oh, you can't even read it on the screen. How do I attract a hot but really nice guy? Well, the main thing on my list, blah, blah, I want to date this hot guy. So this is the kind of stuff that's on Yahoo Answers, right? And what I love in these is that some of these questions are just stories in themselves. Like, they're so intense, they're so emotionally loaded. And that one's really silly. This one is really sad. How soon after a divorce should you get back into a serious relationship? First of all, you're asking this on the internet. Second of all, that's really sad. Like, I want somebody to help you, but anybody that comes to help you in this context of Yahoo Answers is not going to be helpful. Like, there's no way that kind of help that you need can be facilitated through this interface. But still, there are these really great stories. This was one of my first features, or favorite features when this worked. You could do a search. I don't know why. Someday I typed in macaroons, and this is the first question that comes up if you search for macaroons. This is like the most beautiful thing I've ever read in my life. How many macaroons could I eat in 5 minutes without dying because of it? And to clarify, I'm 165 pounds, 16-year-old male, good health. I use Yahoo Answers. I'm 5'11 and a half. Specifically, they're Goodman's coconut macaroons. In case the brand matters, you can find out info online. Assume it's 10:30 at night. Everything unless otherwise specified is normal. Nothing about this is normal. Explain your answer. And somebody, so this is like, I know this doesn't sort of fit the definition of story or narrative maybe in the way that our other panelists would think about it, but it's compelling enough to compel someone else to respond with an answer. So no more than one every 4 seconds. For obvious reasons, even if you can swallow them whole, you'll need longer to complete the swallow. Any more than that, they'll just hang out in your mouth and start to occlude your airway. This is like quasi-pre-med, doctor wannabe kind of answer. So I love these sort of like weird explorations into non-traditional, like sort of data-driven, but super weird and unexpected stories. And the last thing I'll show you really quick was this project I did called Dictionary Words that sort of is the most reductive thing. Let's just watch this for a second and then I'll talk about it. Oh, there's occlude again. Such a good word. Well, I won't take too much of your time, actually, in case nothing interesting comes up. But essentially, it's just pulling from an English language dictionary and putting 2 words on the screen. The first iteration of this project just put 1 word up on the screen, and it was like slightly hypnotic because it would just kind of fade in and out. But once you start combining kind of 2 elements of meaning, 2 words, a lot of times it's just kind of garbage nonsense. But more often than not, you actually get something that's really like triggers something, and it ends up being silly or sad or having some sort of emotional response. So some of my favorites are on here, like scorned smokers, discovery evicted, pentasyllabic wooer, unrequested shortcuts. So I don't really know what this means in the context of our discussion, but I think there's. Oh, suddenly I realized I'm up in front of an audience. There are people. I thought this was a dream, a bad dream. I don't know, nonlinear narrative. I want to talk about it. That's all. Thanks.
So Scott, I'm starting to understand why HTML5 dev were reluctant to embrace your philosophy at the core of their conference. Okay, we do have some questions using the Twitter hashtag, but while these great nuggets are still fresh in our memory, I'll just open it up to the audience now to instant responses to some of those points raised. Who wants to start? Oh, Google. You're not going to offer Scott a job as well? No.
One thing that I think about a lot, mostly because I talk to people around the world a lot, is cross-cultural interpretations and how things, this is part of the context, which I think a number of people brought up, but things like, and I'm sorry, I'm going to blank on, somebody was talking about how we like left to right flows yesterday. Well, but if somebody actually is in a right to left language as their natural flow, they may actually prefer right to left to do a linear or top to bottom, depending. So I think that's I don't know if anybody has a lot of experience researching this, because I think a lot about it, but I don't know a lot about it, so I'm interested in that.
So since I talked about that, I'm not sure if it's going to work. Since I talked about this very briefly, the left to right thing, depending on the paper you read, is supposedly universal, or maybe it's not, but there is one paper at least that actually has this in the title. It says something like an indicator for a universal left to right blah something of time. So this is specifically about our conception of time and how that has a left to right bias. But then there are other papers that say, well, there are cultural differences and it depends on a number of things. But of course there are other things. There are things like color. There are conventions that you would use in different cultures, even in different countries. Like we heard at the very beginning about what color is a road, right? Is it blue or yellow or whatever colors are used in different countries? I had no idea that they were blue in the UK. So I think that's important.
Swastikas are a really great example of this, because if you look at a map in Japan, Buddhist temples are often tagged as swastika, as a different orientation. But
yeah, the other way around, right? Yeah.
Terribly shocking for somebody from Europe or the US.
I have a practical answer to that, which is we've just been doing some infographics for Google Israel, and we did them left to right, and everyone seemed happy. So that's anecdote, not data, I know.
Yeah, I mean, at BBC we have like lots and lots of language, 27 language sites, and so a lot of the infographics that we do get converted into the infographics for left to right languages as well. And I think it's not always easy to predict exactly what will work and what won't, and I think our designers are very good at it, but they have trouble with that sometimes. But the best thing to do is to ask people who actually are Arabic or from, who, and they will tell you what the conventions are. It's quite easy to find out.
Any other questions? I'll go to the Twitter sphere for this one. There's a good one to come in from Greg. What are the costs of good storytelling, e.g. bias, simplification, advocation, and when are they acceptable or unacceptable? It's a nice easy one for you. So what are the costs of good storytelling, e.g. bias, simplification, advocation, and when are they unacceptable costs? So that's one question. I'll read a couple of these out, actually, so we'll give you time to think about it. There was one for Scott, actually. It's come in from Joe saying, in your keynote, you seemed to discourage failure. Do you not think that failure can be beneficial?
Failures for the weak.
But the weekends can be successful.
Brilliant answer. Right, next one. And this.
I thought we were going through all the questions. I can answer properly.
Sorry, well, all right. Do you want to? I wanted to give you time to think about a few of them. Do you want to read them out? Okay. You can pick the one you want to answer that way, maybe, right? So we've got one here. How does responsive design influence the data representation choices you make in interactive visualization projects? And that was from someone on my team, and I'm really pleased with that question, because when we invited abstracts for Graphical Web this year, it was interesting that there were no dedicated papers offered about responsive graphics. although we seem to pick up that they were implicit in some of the papers and some of the talks. So really interested to hear some thoughts about responsive design challenges for visualization. So that's 3 questions if we include the failure one. Do we want to pick through some of them? Who wants to pick one of them and run with it?
I mean, I can talk about the cost of good storytelling and when is it not acceptable. So I guess when you're the art of doing a news story and writing is to reduce things down to something which is easily understandable. But what you're trying to do is make things simple and not simplistic, I guess. And that's and so it's never right to be biased, I guess, unless it's a column piece or unless it's a perspective piece. I think that it's I think what you strive for as a journalist is to be to represent something in an impartial, fair way, and you definitely can tell a story quite simply. And so I think you've got to work out that on the BBC News website, I mean, there's a whole range of stories that are told in many different ways, and so you can have big, long analysis pieces, or you can have things that are very simple for people who just have 2 minutes to catch up. What are the top 10 things I need to know about? What do I need to know about Syria? Where are we up to? What's happened in the Ukraine? You might not have the time to sift through like 10 pieces. You might just want to know one thing, the latest thing.
Okay, thanks, Bella. Anybody else want to pick up on either of those questions? Responsive design?
Well, I was sort of caught by the first one. I think simplification and selection, I think, is the great cost of storytelling. You could only tell so many stories, you only have so much space, you only have so much time to produce, you only have so many resources to produce, and there is inevitably in the organizational structure of an organization some sort of bias towards particular types of stories that you pursue. That's kind of an unavoidable reality of news gathering. What I think is not acceptable, which we can now escape because of the new types of storytelling that are possible online, is the tendency to select the narrative you want before looking at the data. Journalism kind of inverts the scientific process sometimes and kind of says, well, we want to show this. Can we go find, pick and choose some data selectively to demonstrate that? And I think that's a lot more difficult when you're putting the entire data set out there. You're saying, okay, here are the 3 case studies that we think are important, but now over to you, readers. That kind of exposes that slightly shoddy practice that I fear is fairly common. So, I actually think that sort of the ability to publish data rather than use it in-house to tell a story and then push out that selective story actually it makes it more difficult to be biased in a sort of unconscious way.
Thanks. That's interesting, because does that mean then that in organisations like the BBC and the FT that the editorial process for visual and data-driven journalism differs from other forms of journalism within the same organisation? Is there a separation in terms of the content that you're producing relative to other journalistic content that might be produced within the organisation?
I think it's a bit like what Martin was saying, is that you ask for, I suppose the difference now is that you ask for all the data. And so rather than, and not everybody will do this, but that actually somebody's done a big survey or they've done an FOI of every local authority for something or other, is that actually what you want to do is get all of the data, not just the one line that they want to people want to put out. And the one line may be the most obvious, the most interesting, what somebody considers the most useful thing. But what you can do within data journalism is show all the other things too that exist within that. And I think that's the sort of something that we've got to kind of get more into the habit of doing.
Okay. This is just a personal question. Would it be easier for you guys to publish a more misleading graphic than misleading text? Does the form make it easier? We've seen, I mean, it's really interesting from a statistics perspective. A lot of the examples of how to lie with statistics, the book by Darrell Huff, are visual. And so there is this question, because we've seen lots of evidence, the video from Scott, about how we kind of like to put things together and kind of make kind of assumptions about what we're seeing visually. So we can mislead people with graphics. we can persuade them that there's a zombie invasion imminent. Would it be easier to publish those kind of stories that might be misleading if they were visual as opposed to textual? I'm just interested if that's ever been an issue or if it's something that,
I guess it depends on the subbing process and who's looking at it and checking it before it goes, and is there another, somebody's looking over it before. So maybe people aren't as rigorous as with some types of visualization as they might be with some text. Maybe there isn't a history of being as rigorous with subbing and checking within a graphic. I don't know that it is. That I think you can publish misleading things in both ways, and people do. Unintentionally misleading.
Okay.
Say something about that, Alan?
Yeah, sure, Scott.
As an experienced journalist, no, I have no journalism experience. But for what it's worth, I think about Cameron was mentioning earlier the sailor who used his swim map to find a better course, and it's just so scary and terrifying because that's not what that graphic was intended to do. I often think about information graphics as we have this problem where people trust graphics, right? Which maybe you want them to trust you, maybe you want them to be critical of you, or critical of graphics by other people who you don't trust. But I think about it like kind of the early days, like pre-Photoshop photography, where in photography we always thought like, oh, well, this is documentation, this is fact, this is truth, we can use this in a courtroom. If I see a picture of something, this actually happened at some point in time. And I think information graphics are like that now in kind of popular culture because we see more and more and more graphics, and the instinct is just to trust them. So it's like, oh, well, it's a chart. Like how could anything? A chart can't lie. A chart can't be wrong. The data behind it can't be wrong. I mean, nobody even thinks to that point. I mean, well, where did the data come from? Who collected it? What's their bias? What's their influence? So I can't speak to like whether one is better or worse, but to me that's like a huge concern, is getting people to be really critical about every kind of visual graphic they see and think about what went into that and why did it go that way. Because it's not fact. It's always somebody's interpretation of something, and there are many places where that process could go wrong.
Yeah, so does that mean, do you think that there's a duty of care for the visualization and journalistic community on kind of graphical literacy? Like we know that people don't look at scales or axes when, it's a secondary process for them. As producers, do we need to take responsibility for that?
I think we do, and I think that the news audience for the BBC News, I mean, we get complaints, people do look at, maybe not a wide range, maybe not as many people who look at the text, but if we have made a mistake, you can guarantee that somebody will spot it, many people will spot it, and they'll come back to us pretty sharpish. So I think there is a level of, visual literacy out there, but maybe it's not as high as we'd hope.
But actually, can I add something to this? There's an additional component to this, which is that when you do graphics, or when people look at graphics, they always, I think it's a bit like what Scott was talking about. The first of all, they demand all the numbers to be there. I mean, not necessarily as numbers, but represented. So trying to summarize is actually much harder. And so if you just have like a paragraph of text that said that lists a few numbers, it's never going to have 100 numbers in it because someone's going to read that. But when you do a chart of something over a certain amount of time, people will want every single month in there. They don't want just to kind of the rough outline of what the shape looked like, even though it might actually be more useful because that's kind of the more interesting information, because maybe all the noise doesn't actually help you understand what's going on. And and then of course they're going to ask you things like, so this is to the Photoshop point, they're going to say, well, what did you leave out? Why did you restrict this to just that part and not show the whole thing? And there are that seems to bring up more questions than when you just say something. Like when it's text, people don't seem to distrust it quite as much for some reason. It seems like seeing a bit more data then kind of opens up this whole floodgate of saying, well, but is that all? Maybe there should be even more and more context and so on. So it kind of goes both ways, I think, at least what I've seen.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Any other comments on any of those questions? Or do you want me to give you a couple more?
I think we have to be responsible when we make graphics, and we have to know the basic rules to make them look right. Because as with the Earth example, as it exemplifies, we cannot unsee what we've seen, even if we if we rationally can deduce that it's not correct, that the scale doesn't start at 0 or anything like that, or that it should represent a static point in time, but it's moving, so we cannot unsee the movement.
Yeah.
So,
That's a good point. We cannot unsee what we've seen, and I think that refers to one of the things in Robert's paper, which was seen as a strength of the visual storytelling genre, which is the memorability of it, the ability of the visuals to stick in the brain long after you've moved away from the screen. Any response to from the audience to those points?
Just thinking on your point about photoshopping, that we don't regard it as okay to Photoshop images for journalism. I work with climate scientists, so you can see where this might be heading now. Is it okay to take published data, plots, image, maps and so on from scientific publications and then edit those for publication to better tell a story? Why is it okay to edit scientific data to make a story when it's not okay to edit a photojournalist's pictures?
Because scientists usually are really, really bad at these things. No, I'm serious. You should. So there's a talk by Jonathan Coram where he shows that and he also has this on his website, 13point.com, I think is his website, and he shows the original. This is about a whale, how the whale dives and feeds. This is called lunge feeding. The whale lunges through at a certain depth. And he just makes the whole thing much clearer by adding something back that they took out, which is the depth of the whole dive.
Okay.
And there are tons of more examples like that.
What I know from that actually is now that there's a deliberate movement amongst many scientists to make graphics that are not usable in journalistic methods. They're going for ugly diagrams. To separate their work out from yours.
And I think there are a couple of things there. The other thing is to remember that the photojournalist frames, shoots, chooses his angle, chooses his light when he's taking the photograph, let alone when he develops it. So that's his skill as an artist. It's not equivalent to the job of the scientist in terms of gathering all the data, right?
Can I add something about that? Because one of the issues that happens in scientific publications or scientific work, and especially in the meteorology world, you pay a lot of attention to be able to communicate uncertainty. And I have seen virtually no examples in papers, in any kind of visual representation to try to communicate uncertainty to the viewer of that particular graph or that particular plot. And that's something that, people need to start thinking about, because it's true, every single point that you put in a graph has an error bar. And that's being ignored massively.
The public hate them.
I don't think it's true.
We need to find some language to help express that, I think, because you're right. And every time I'm talking to scientists, this comes up. How do I do, the master classes, we get analysts. How do I show error to the public?
But can I...
They understand the idea, the visuals are perplex them.
For example, in meteorology, there has been quite a lot of research, and there is quite a lot of intuition in the public that they understand that the longer a forecast goes, the less precise it's going to be. So automatically they are putting already an error bar into the figure. And when you start displaying kind of an explicit error bar in there, it's very intuitively kind of understood by most people. And quite often we have people telling us, oh, the public is not going to understand it. When we actually check this with the public, the scores are amazing. The public gets it.
That's interesting.
There's one space in which this is becoming quite common, and that's polling, political polling. So if you go to the Huffington Post's pollster website, for example, every poll there has the error bars across it. I think this is one of the areas in which journalism is definitely understanding the crude nature of the historical approach to this. So every slight movement in a poll month on month historically gets reported, but Nate Silver has done us all a great service in sort of insisting that only the data in aggregate is really what matters. And so there are places where this is being taken a lot more seriously. But we could have an entire conference on communicating uncertainty and communicating probability. This is something that journalism schools have courses on. I guess this is a very difficult area. I don't think we're going to answer in a few seconds.
And I think a lot of people have talked about the need for visual literacy. I think generally humans have amazing visual literacy. What a lot of people don't have is charting literacy. It basically boils down to there is a specialist language in a lot of charting that people often need help to grasp the basics. Then they're fine.
Good. So that's a great question, and I'd love to come in on that, because your question about should you rework charts? Yes, you should. I think there's a really big assumption that charts are neutral, and they're not. Charts are not neutral. A great example that Robert and I have both blogged about is the Iraq's bloody toll chart that Simon Scar did in the South China Morning Post, and it was a downward pointing red bar chart showing the deaths in Iraq over 10 years. Pointing down in red, it looks like blood. He made a deliberate decision on how to design that chart, and if you go to my blog, you can see if you just turn it around, make it blue, and change the title, the message is completely different. And people can make those design decisions deliberately or subconsciously. And so the message of a visualization is rarely neutral. So yeah, as Tobias said, photos are framed, but as are data visualizations, and the data is there for you to reinterpret as you wish, is my opinion.
But peer-reviewed publications don't use red, and they're not designed to be used that way. And then when they get taken by journalists and altered to be like that, to tell their story, it's like photoshopping, I would say.
Yeah, and it's like distorting the quotes of a politician.
Yeah, but they're not designed for people other than experts, are they? That's the thing. So I think you should complain to the journalist if you think they've misrepresented your work very vociferously.
But only if it actually misrepresents the work. Because a former student of mine, who's now a postdoc, he's doing work with climate scientists, and he's specifically working with them on charts and on visualizations. And I can tell you, I have seen things that words cannot describe. I mean, it's beyond horrible. And these are published, peer-reviewed charts. They're unbelievably bad. And so it may be true that everybody loves their charts, even, I'm not going to go into whatever, but there is something about trying to communicate and doing an analysis. We had this quote in some of the talks about, the last analytical chart you create is then your presentation chart, right? But that's not how things really work. If you want to communicate to people, you have to think about who they are, what they know, what you want to get across, and you have to reduce the 10,000 overlapping things that you think represent uncertainty into something that people can actually read and they want to read. And I think that's an important part of this. And if they misrepresent and distort the message, that's a problem. But if they represent the data correctly, or at least the conclusion correctly, I think that's perfectly correct and fair. And it's actually a big service, because people now actually understand what these guys are doing, whereas before they would never have even bothered looking.
Thanks, Robert. When we put the program and the schedule together today, I wanted to get this kind of conversation brewing and then move to a warship to finish it off. So if you want to talk with Robert while he stood next to a cannon later this evening, we can do that. We are out of time now, because I want to make sure that everyone's got enough time to drop off bags and change into your warship clothing and meet by reception at 5:15. But before you go, could I just ask you to show your appreciation for the panelists for a very interesting session? Thanks.